For 3 months, the baby touched her ear. Every specialist said the same thing. Congenital. Irreversible. Her father spent fortunes, chartered flights to world capitals, begged the most brilliant minds in medicine to look again. They all turned away with the same expression. Pity mixed with certainty. Then a maid noticed something no one else did, and what she found inside that infant's ear will shake you to your core. Donald Whittam was a billionaire. Penthouses in 3 countries, a yacht longer than most city blocks, wealth that could reshape economies. But his daughter was born deaf. 3 months old, never responded to a single sound. Donald tried everything. Mayo Clinic, Zurich, specialists from Tokyo who commanded 6 figures just to walk through the door. They ran genetic panels, auditory brainstem tests, procedures with names most people can't pronounce. All of them delivered the same verdict. Incurable. Learn to live with it. But Donald couldn't live with it because this child was all he had left. His wife Catherine died on the delivery table, her last breath spent bringing their daughter into the world. So Donald kept searching, kept writing checks with more zeros, kept praying to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago. What he didn't know, the answer wasn't hiding in some cutting-edge research facility. It was coming from the woman he'd just hired to dust his furniture. Shamika Seal was a maid. 26 years old. No medical degree, no credentials, just a woman trying to keep her grandmother out of a state-run nursing home where people went to be forgotten. But she noticed something about the baby that every high-priced specialist had overlooked. Something in her ear. Something dark and unnatural. And one afternoon while Donald was in a board meeting, she made a decision that would either save that child's hearing or end her own future. What happened next? You need to see it for yourself. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The Whittam estate stretched across 52 acres of Massachusetts coastline. From the road, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Georgian architecture, limestone facades that glowed golden at sunset, gardens so precisely maintained they looked painted onto the landscape. But inside, suffocation. Not the comfortable quiet of a library. Not the peaceful hush of meditation. This was the silence of a tomb. A silence that pressed against your chest and made you forget how to breathe properly. Staff moved through the marble hallways like ghosts. Their shoes were soft-soled by mandate. Their voices never rose above a whisper. They'd learned within days of hiring. Mr. Whittam demanded absolute quiet. No music disturbed the air in that house, no television chatter, no innocent laughter echoing through the rooms. Just silence. Crushing, relentless silence. And somewhere in that silence, a man was losing his mind. Donald Whittam spent his evenings in the West Wing study, staring at the oil painting above the mantel, Catherine in her wedding dress, her smile so alive it seemed cruel to capture it in something as lifeless as paint. Donald hadn't spoken to his daughter in 2 weeks. Not because he didn't want to. Because what was the point? She couldn't hear him. The doctors had made that devastatingly clear. He stood at the nursery door most nights, watching the night nurse rock her in the antique chair Catherine had picked out before everything went wrong. The baby was beautiful. Catherine's nose, his dark hair, perfect in every way except the one that mattered most. Dr. Hendricks from Boston Children's had been the first to say it. Congenital sensorineural hearing loss. Bilateral. Profound. The words felt like bullets. Then came Dr. Schweitzer from Zurich, who charged $40,000 to fly in and confirm what Hendricks already said. Then the team from Tokyo, the specialist from London, the experimental program in Stockholm that took $3 million and delivered nothing but apologies. They all said the same thing with different accents. Your daughter will never hear your voice. She'll never hear her mother's name. She'll never hear music, laughter, the sound of rain. Accept it. Adapt. Move forward. But how do you move forward when you're drowning in the past? Catherine had died believing their daughter was perfect. She'd held her for 17 seconds before the hemorrhaging took her, whispering, "She's so beautiful," with her last conscious breath. Donald had promised her in that moment, promised a woman who could no longer hear him, that he'd give their daughter everything. Everything except the one thing that mattered. He'd stopped going into the nursery after the Stockholm trip. Stopped pretending the specialists might be wrong. Stopped hoping. The house had fallen silent not because his daughter couldn't hear, but because Donald had forgotten how to speak. The staff whispered about it in the kitchen. Mr. Whittam is giving up. Mr. Whittam doesn't even look at her anymore. Mr. Whittam is disappearing into that study and might never come out. They weren't wrong. Shamika Seal took the job because Grandma Rose had 3 weeks left at Brightview before the state facility came calling. 3 weeks before the place with the stained hallways and the smell that never left your clothes. 3 weeks before the nurses who didn't bother learning names. The Whittam estate paid twice what anywhere else offered. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, had made that clear during the interview. Mr. Whittam values discretion and silence. You'll work the second floor. You'll never speak unless spoken to. You'll never enter the West Wing study. And you'll never, under any circumstances, touch the child. Shamika had nodded at everything. She would have nodded if Mrs. Calloway had asked her to scrub floors with her bare hands. Grandma Rose needed $1,400 a week to stay at Brightview, and Shamika's 2 other jobs combined weren't covering half of that. Her first day, she'd arrived at dawn when the estate was still wrapped in that unnatural quiet. The other staff barely acknowledged her. A nod here, a whispered, second-floor linen closet, there. Nobody smiled. Nobody welcomed her. They all moved like they were afraid of waking something that should stay asleep. By noon, Shamika had dusted 17 rooms and hadn't seen a single member of the Whittam family. Just photographs. Mr. Whittam in a suit shaking hands with people who looked important. A woman in a wedding dress who must have been his wife. A nursery door that stayed closed. Mrs. Calloway appeared at 2 o'clock with a list of additional duties and a reminder. The baby is not your concern. The night nurse handles everything. You clean around her schedule, never during. Shamika had nodded again. But that night, lying in her efficiency apartment with Grandma Rose's medical bills spread across the table, she wondered what kind of house made a baby feel like a secret that needed keeping. The night nurse called in sick on Shamika's 5th day. Some stomach thing that had her apologizing profusely over the phone to Mrs. Calloway, who looked like she'd been personally betrayed. You'll handle the nursery today, Mrs. Calloway said, her voice sharp enough to cut. Dust, vacuum, change the linens in the adjacent room. The baby stays in her crib. Don't touch her. Mr. Whittam has someone coming at 4. Shamika entered the nursery just after 10. The room was beautiful in that cold, expensive way. Cream walls, imported French furniture, toys that looked too perfect to actually play with. And in the center, a white crib where the baby lay awake, staring at nothing. She was so small. 3 months old, maybe 4. Shamika had cousins with babies, knew that look when something wasn't right. This child wasn't crying, wasn't making sounds, just lying there with her tiny fist pressed against the side of her head. Shamika started dusting, keeping her distance like she'd been told. But every few seconds, she'd glance back. The baby kept doing it. Rubbing her ear. Tugging at it with those impossibly small fingers. Wincing. That wince stopped Shamika cold. Deaf babies didn't wince at touch. She'd watched her cousin's deaf son. He touched everything without reaction, exploring the world through feeling alone. But this baby was pulling away from her own hand like it hurt. Shamika moved closer to the crib, her heart starting to pound. The baby's right ear looked red around the opening. Irritated. The little fingers kept reaching for it, kept pulling back. "What's wrong, baby girl?" Shamika whispered, knowing she'd be fired if Mrs. Calloway walked in. The baby turned toward her voice. Not to the sound, she couldn't hear it, but maybe to the movement, the air shifting. And in that moment, Shamika saw something that made her breath catch. Something dark. Deep in that tiny ear canal. Something that didn't belong. Shamika's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. This was crazy. She was a maid, not a doctor. Mrs. Calloway's voice echoed in her head. "Don't touch her. Never touch her." But that baby kept wincing, kept pulling at her ear like she was trying to tell someone something and nobody was listening. Shamika leaned over the crib, angling the light carefully toward the baby's ear. The infant turned her head slightly, and for just a moment, the angle was perfect. There. Deep in the canal. Something solid. Not wax. Shamika had cleaned enough ears in her life to know what earwax looked like. This was different. Dense. Almost crystalline. It caught the light and threw it back in fragments, like broken glass embedded in soft tissue. Her stomach dropped. How had the doctors missed this? The specialists who charged enough to buy a house? The people with their fancy equipment and medical degrees covering entire walls? She pulled the light back, her mind racing. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was supposed to be there, some part of the ear she didn't understand. But that made no sense. And the baby's constant discomfort, the way she favored turning her head away from that side, the redness around the opening, none of that was normal. Shamika looked toward the nursery door. Mrs. Calloway would be doing her rounds. Mr. Whittam was probably locked in that study like always. The replacement nurse wouldn't arrive for hours. She could walk away. Finish dusting. Pretend she hadn't seen anything. Keep this job that was saving Grandma Rose. Or she could do something that would probably get her fired and possibly arrested. The baby whimpered softly, her little fist finding that ear again. Shamika made her decision. She went to find tweezers. Shamika was halfway down the hall when Mrs. Calloway's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Miss Seal." A word. Shamika's heart nearly stopped. She turned slowly, trying to keep her face neutral. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway of the linen room, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between suspicion and irritation. "Yes, ma'am." "How long were you in the nursery?" "Just cleaning, ma'am." "Like you asked." Mrs. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "I passed by twice. Saw you standing over that crib. That's not cleaning." Shamika's mouth went dry. The baby seemed uncomfortable. "I was just." "You were just overstepping." Mrs. Calloway moved closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't know what you think you saw, Miss Seal, but that child has been examined by the best doctors money can buy. People with decades of training. People who actually know what they're doing. I understand, but..." "No. You don't understand." Mrs. Calloway's finger came up, pointing directly at Shamika's chest. "You're here to clean. To dust and vacuum and stay invisible. You're not here to play nurse. You're not here to diagnose. You're certainly not here to touch Mr. Whittam's daughter." Shamika felt something hot rising in her chest. She's in pain. She's deaf. The doctors have explained this. Mr. Whittam has accepted it. And you need to stay in your lane before you find yourself looking for another job. Mrs. Calloway stepped even closer. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear. The same clarity Shamika had seen her whole life. People like her weren't supposed to question people like them. People like her were supposed to nod and smile and accept what they were told. Yes, ma'am, Shamika whispered. But as Mrs. Calloway walked away, Shamika's hand closed around the phone in her pocket. She hadn't agreed to anything. That night, Shamika sat in her apartment staring at a photograph she kept in her wallet. Marcus. 7 years old in that picture, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. He'd be 17 now if he'd lived. He'd complained about his stomach for weeks. Kept saying it hurt, kept doubling over during recess. Mama had taken him to the free clinic twice. Both times, they'd said the same thing. Growing pains. Give him Tylenol. He'll be fine. He wasn't fine. By the time the pain got bad enough that the emergency room couldn't turn them away, the appendix had already burst. Sepsis had already started spreading through his small body like poison. The doctor who finally looked at him, really looked at him, had gone pale. Why didn't you bring him in sooner? Mama had cried for 3 days after the funeral. I tried. I kept trying. They wouldn't listen. Shamika had been 16. Old enough to understand what had happened but too young to do anything about it. Marcus had died because he was poor. Because the people who were supposed to help had decided his pain wasn't worth their time. She'd made a promise at his grave. Never again. If she ever saw someone suffering, someone being ignored, she wouldn't stay quiet. She wouldn't stay in her lane. Shamika looked at Marcus's photo for a long time, then pulled out her phone. She Googled "object stuck in baby ear" and spent 2 hours reading medical forums, watching videos, learning what could happen if something stayed lodged in an ear canal for months. Infection. Permanent damage. Pain that an infant couldn't even communicate. The doctors had missed it. Or worse, they'd seen it and ignored it. Either way, that baby was suffering, and everyone around her had decided her pain was acceptable. Shamika put Marcus's photo back in her wallet. Tomorrow, she'd break every rule Mrs. Calloway had given her. And she'd do it without permission. Shamika waited until Mr. Whittam left for his afternoon meeting. She watched his car disappear down the long driveway, then moved quickly to the nursery before she could lose her nerve. The baby was awake, that tiny fist already reaching for her ear. Shamika's hands trembled as she pulled the tweezers from her pocket. She'd boiled them twice that morning, wrapped them in clean cloth like the medical videos had shown. Please forgive me if I'm wrong, she whispered, lifting the baby gently from the crib. And please, God, guide my hands if I'm right. The baby was so light, so fragile. Shamika positioned her carefully on the changing table, turned on her phone's flashlight, and angled it toward that small ear canal. There it was. That dark, glistening mass. Shamika's breath caught. Up close, it looked worse than she'd thought. Jagged edges. Foreign. Wrong. She steadied her hand, brought the tweezers close, and whispered another prayer. The first attempt, she pulled back. Too scared. The second attempt, her hand shook too much. But the third time, muscle memory from years of caring for family took over. Steady. Gentle. Precise. The tweezers caught something solid. Shamika pulled, slow and careful, and felt resistance. The baby whimpered. Shamika's heart hammered against her ribs. Almost there. Almost. It came free. A jagged, crystal-like mass, dark and dense, sitting on the tweezers like an accusation. Shamika stared at it, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. Then the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed. And the baby's eyes went wide. Her head turned sharply toward the sound. Her mouth opened in surprise. And then she did something she'd never done before. She cried out. Not in pain. In response. Donald Whittam came home early because Mrs. Calloway had called him, her voice shaking with something between panic and rage. Sir, you need to come home. Now. It's about the baby. And the maid. He'd broken every speed limit getting there. When he burst through the nursery door, he found Shamika standing by the crib, tears streaming down her face, holding his daughter. And his daughter, his deaf daughter, was turning her head toward his footsteps. What did you do? The words came out like a growl. Shamika held out her hand. In her palm lay something dark and jagged. It was in her ear, Mr. Whittam. Blocking everything. She's not deaf. She never was. Donald's world tilted sideways. 2 hours later, they were at Massachusetts General. The head of pediatric otolaryngology, Dr. Chen, examined the baby with increasingly wide eyes. Then she asked for the medical records. All of them. Donald watched her face change as she scrolled through the files on her tablet. Watched her stop on something. Watched her jaw tighten. Mr. Whittam, Dr. Chen said quietly. I need to show you something. She turned the tablet toward him. Scan results from the Tokyo clinic. Dated 4 months ago, when his daughter was just weeks old. And there, highlighted in the radiologist's notes, dense foreign body visible in right external auditory canal. Recommend immediate removal. The word swam in front of Donald's eyes. There are 3 other flags, Dr. Chen continued, her voice carefully controlled. Zurich. Stockholm. London. They all saw it. Every single one of them documented it. Donald couldn't breathe. Why didn't they? Because you were paying them to find a cure for deafness, Mr. Whittam. Not to look for something simple. Dr. Chen's expression was pure disgust. As long as she stayed incurably deaf, you kept writing checks. Donald looked at his daughter, hearing sounds for the first time in her life. And then he looked at the woman who'd saved her. Donald found Shamika in the hospital waiting room, still wearing her maid's uniform, her hands clasped tight in her lap. She looked up when he approached, and he saw fear flash across her face. She thought he was going to have her arrested. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Mr. Whittam, she started, but he held up his hand. I almost had security throw you out of my house. His voice cracked. I almost fired you for caring about my daughter more than I did. You were grieving. I was blind. Donald looked at his hands, the hands that had signed checks for millions, the hands that had never once held his daughter close enough to notice her pain. They told me she was broken, and I believed them because they had degrees on their walls and letters after their names. And you, he met her eyes. You saw what they refused to see. Shamika's tears started falling again. I couldn't walk away. My brother. I know. Dr. Chen had told him everything Shamika had shared. About Marcus. About the promise. About choosing courage over her job, over her grandmother's care, over her own safety. You risked everything. Donald stood slowly, his decision already made. I'm firing every specialist who touched my daughter's case. I'm pursuing legal action for medical fraud. And I'm setting up a foundation in my wife's name to make sure no family ever pays for a miracle that greed kept hidden. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is a check. It covers your grandmother's care at Brightview for the next 10 years. And there's a second check, your salary as my daughter's full-time caregiver. If you'll take it. Shamika stared at the envelope, then at him. The willing hands, Donald whispered. Catherine used to say God's miracles come through willing hands. He smiled for the first time in months. Thank you for being willing.